The story you've been told about how the Cold War started is missing about half the picture. Most versions give you the Truman Doctrine, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, maybe a mention of George Kennan's long telegram, and then the arms race. And that's not wrong, but it leaves out some of the most revealing details of the whole thing. Details that actually explain why two countries that fought side by side against Hitler ended up pointing nuclear weapons at each other within a few years of the war ending. So that's what this video is about. We're going to walk through the real shift from wartime cooperation to Cold War confrontation, and we're going to do it using some of the pieces that almost never make it into the mainstream version of this story. By the end, you'll understand not just what happened, but why it was probably unavoidable. And there's one twist at the very end, involving the man who invented the containment strategy himself, that completely reframes everything that comes before it. Let's start with something that happened before the war was even over, because that's where the real story begins. It's May 1945. Germany has just surrendered. People across Europe are celebrating in the streets. And Winston Churchill, one of the architects of the Allied victory, quietly orders his military planners to draw up a surprise attack on the Soviet Union. The creation of the plans was ordered by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in May 1945. Codenamed Unthinkable, the plan called for a massive surprise assault on Soviet positions in Europe by British and American troops, with support from German and Japanese forces, including the rearming of somewhere between 100,000 and 700,000 former Wehrmacht soldiers. The stated goal was to push Soviet forces back out of Poland and Eastern Europe. Think about what that means. The ink on Germany's surrender was barely dry. The war wasn't finished in the Pacific. And Churchill was already wargaming an attack on his own ally, using the same German soldiers they just defeated. Both plans were top secret and were not made public until 1998. So for over 50 years, this never entered the public conversation about how the Cold War started. Due to the huge numerical superiority of the Red Army, it was thought a short, sharp Allied attack into Poland would fail, leaving total war the only outcome. So the plan was shelved. But the fact that it existed at all tells you something important. The distrust wasn't a reaction to Soviet behavior after 1945. It was baked in from the very beginning, at the highest levels of Allied war planning. And here's the thing that makes it even more complicated. There's a real possibility the Soviets found out. In June 1945, just 1 month before the proposed invasion date, Georgy Zhukov suddenly ordered troops stationed in Poland to regroup and prepare for defensive action. Whether that was coincidence or not, it shows that both sides were already maneuvering against each other while they were still technically on the same team. So by the time the war officially ended, you already had deep suspicion running in both directions. What happened next is where most Cold War histories pick up, but they usually miss the internal fight that was happening inside the US government itself. Inside the State Department, in the mid-1940s, there were essentially two rival schools of thought on how to read the Soviet Union. Diplomats who had been stationed in Riga, Latvia before the war, a key listening post on the USSR, tended to be deeply skeptical of Soviet intentions. They believed Stalin's expansionism was ideological and essentially unlimited. On the other side, diplomats shaped by the wartime cooperation of the Yalta Conference believed that a working relationship with Moscow was still possible, that Stalin could be reasoned with, and that confrontation would only make things worse. These weren't just academic disagreements. These were the people writing the policy memos, briefing the president, and deciding how America would respond to every Soviet move. The Riga camp and the Yalta camp were fighting over the entire direction of U.S. foreign policy, and almost no one talks about this internal split when explaining why containment happened. The Riga camp won, and the document that settled it was George Kennan's long telegram, sent from Moscow in February 1946. Kennan, a senior U.S. diplomat based in Moscow, sent the State Department his famous long telegram, an attempt to explain Soviet behavior at a time of quickly worsening relations between the superpowers as their wartime alliance unraveled. The telegram argued that the Soviet Union was ideologically committed to expansion and could not be negotiated with in any traditional sense. It landed in Washington like a thunderclap. Kennan's long telegram from Moscow to Washington of February 1946 is the single best-known dispatch in American diplomatic history, and its advocacy of containment shaped the conventional wisdom of a generation. What almost nobody mentions is that the Soviets wrote their own version. Among the first readers of Kennan's missive were Soviet leaders, who obtained the top-secret document through intelligence channels. On orders from Moscow, the Soviet ambassador in Washington, Nikolai Novikov, quickly set to work writing a comparable cable analyzing U.S. motives and behavior. In September 1946, Novikov sent a 19-page cable to Foreign Minister Molotov describing the likely direction of U.S. foreign policy in the post-war period. In 1990, as an aspect of Glasnost, the Soviet Foreign Ministry released the Novikov text, with Foreign Minister Molotov's underlinings. Novikov saw the U.S. government preparing for war with the Soviet Union as part of a drive for world supremacy. So you had two diplomats on opposite sides of the world writing parallel documents to their governments, each arguing that the other side was the aggressor, each providing intellectual cover for hardening their country's foreign policy. Each of them wrote a telegram back to their respective home countries, essentially justifying the impending Cold War. Both telegrams shaped policy. Both fed the spiral, and yet, when this period gets covered in most Western content, you only hear about Kennan's side. The mirror image is left out entirely. Now keep that thought in mind, because we're coming back to Kennan at the very end, and what he said later about his own telegram changes the whole picture. While all of this was happening at the diplomatic level, something was going on in the public that's worth understanding. Most people point to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in March 1946 as the moment American public opinion shifted against the Soviets. But there was something that happened 6 months earlier that arguably did more to move the needle, and it started in Ottawa, Canada, with a Soviet embassy clerk named Igor Gozenko. In September 1945, Gozenko walked out of the Soviet embassy carrying documents that proved a Soviet spy ring was actively operating across North America. This was months before Churchill gave his famous speech, months before most Americans had any reason to think of the USSR as an enemy. The Guzenko defection made the threat feel real and immediate in a way that no diplomatic speech could. It showed ordinary people that the cooperation of the war years had a shadow side, that while Allied soldiers were dying together on the same beaches, Soviet intelligence was already running agents inside Western governments. And yet, it barely survives in the mainstream telling of this story. It usually shows up in spy history content, separated from the containment narrative entirely. But it belongs right here because it's part of what made the public ready to accept a harder line toward Moscow. By 1946, the pieces were all moving at once. And then came the moment that is probably the sharpest single turning point in the whole shift. Sharper than the Truman Doctrine speech, sharper than the Berlin blockade. But it almost never gets the attention it deserves. The Marshall Plan, announced in 1947, offered American economic aid to help rebuild war-devastated Europe. And here's what most versions of the story gloss over. Some of the Soviet satellite states actually wanted in. Czechoslovakia and Poland both initially expressed interest in Marshall Plan aid. Stalin summoned Czech leaders to Moscow and forced them to withdraw their application. He then pressured the other Eastern European states to do the same. Think about what that moment represents. These were countries that had been flattened by the war, desperately in need of reconstruction money, and they were told by Moscow that they were not allowed to accept help from the West. Stalin's decision to reject the Marshall Plan and force his satellites to reject it too drew a hard line across Europe that everyone could see. It wasn't just an ideological divide anymore. It was a physical, economic, political wall. And Stalin built it himself. That's the moment where cooperation didn't just fade. It ended. Now, before we get to the final piece of this, in the Kennan twist I promised you, there's one more thing that deserves to be in this story that almost never is. In 1946, there was a cabinet-level fight inside the Truman administration over whether containment was even the right approach. Henry Wallace, Truman's Secretary of Commerce, gave a speech at Madison Square Garden in September 1946, arguing for continued cooperation with the Soviet Union and pushing back against what he called the get tough policy. He was publicly criticizing the direction of his own government. Truman fired him within days. It was a real dramatic split at the highest levels of American power over exactly the question this video is about. And it's almost never dramatized the way it should be, because the history of this period tends to be told as if containment was inevitable and universally agreed upon. It wasn't. There were people in the room arguing the other side, and they lost. So here's where we are. You've got distrust baked in before the war even ended. You've got rival diplomatic cables, each justifying confrontation. You've got a spy defection that shifted public opinion before the famous speeches. You've got Stalin slamming the door on economic cooperation. You've got a cabinet member fired for suggesting another way. The slide from alliance to Cold War wasn't one decision. It was dozens of decisions made by people on both sides who were reading each other through a lens of suspicion that had been there the whole time. And now the twist. For the rest of his long life, Kennan would combat the widespread conclusion that containment necessarily entailed a military buildup and possibly a military confrontation. He would protest that he had intended containment as a primarily political policy to be applied by adroit diplomats. He argued that the Soviet Union had to be contained by political, diplomatic, economic, and propaganda means rather than military ones. And that's why Kennan, who supported the Marshall Plan, was actually opposed to the formation of NATO, a politico-military alliance aimed at containing the Soviet Union. Just 4 years after Kennan sent his long telegram, his containment policy was being manipulated. Kennan had explicitly defined containment as a political rather than a military strategy, something which did not require a boost in military spending. As one historian put it, after 1947, Kennan could never regard the doctrine with which he was credited as his own. The man who wrote the intellectual foundation for the entire Cold War strategy spent the rest of his career arguing that the world had misread him. That Korea, Vietnam, the global military buildup, none of it was what he meant. He wanted economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, patient political competition. What he got was half a century of military confrontation. So when you ask why containment replaced cooperation, the honest answer is it's not one reason. It's a chain of decisions made under pressure by people who were already suspicious of each other before the war even finished. The distrust wasn't born in 1947, it was just finally admitted in 1947. And maybe the most revealing detail in all of it is that the man whose telegram started the whole thing spent the next 50 years saying everyone got it wrong. And if this kind of history, the stuff that gets left out of the standard version, is something you want more of, subscribing means you won't miss it when it comes out. Drop a comment below too. Do you think the Cold War was inevitable given everything we covered here? Or was there a real moment where it could have gone differently? That's a genuinely interesting question, and I'd like to see where people land on it.